morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the High Dragon's Breath Bow Wow, welcoming you back to another episode of Archon's Armies. A little bit more of a lore video than an army video necessarily for you today, but we have the Adeptus Mechanicus Ordos, and a little bit of AdMech overview stuff. This is going to be a long one, and I am exhausted, so let's jump right into it, with an overview of the Adeptus Mechanicus. For those of you who don't know, which is basically everyone, because by definition, the Adeptus Mechanicus is one big old secret, the Adeptus Mechanicus in the 41st millennium are the technological semi-independent wing of the Imperium of Man. They have a quote-unquote monopoly over a lot of the advanced technology, especially the technology from the Dark Age of technology. So there's often this concept of the Adeptus Mechanicus simply having a monopoly over all technology whatsoever, and the progress of technology is completely limited to what the AdMech can produce or allow to be produced. This is often dramatically overstated. For example, synthetic, technological, or expensively difficult to create things such as augmetics, technical programs, anything electronic or complicated of that nature, any standard template construction technology, that's going to be the purview of the Adeptus Mechanicus, but that doesn't mean that other technology is simply unavailable to the rest of the Imperium. I have seen many different people argue about where the line is drawn with what X or Y planet can or cannot produce with the Mechanicus' help or without it. I think a pretty good line in the sand to draw is that if it is a technology that existed or could have existed before the year, let's say roughly 1930 or 1940, the AdMech have no control over it. So that means that plenty of high quality and large power combustion engines, various levels of power plants, and lots of electronics, especially simple electronics, are available to any Imperial world that chooses to produce them. Whereas anything more advanced than that, and especially things that are more software, computer, or technological based, are going to be the purview of the Adeptus Mechanicus in exclusivity, or in partial exclusivity, where they may send out various pieces of technology to be replicated on other worlds. And of course there's the futuristic technology, which is mostly their purview alone, or licensed out for production. They are, however, an incredibly secretive priesthood. They keep almost all of their cards very close to the vest, and that's one of the reasons why a lot of the things that we quote-unquote know about them are limited. The lore on the Adeptus Mechanicus is woefully poor and full of blind spots and confusing areas that you kind of have to fill in for. I am always of the opinion, as I've talked about before with the AdMech, of the AdMech have a minimal and dispersive effect upon the Imperium because they are so secretive and because the expansive growth of mankind simply far outstrips the number of forges. For example, for every single AdMech forge, every major one, or world that is theirs, for example, there are likely 10 to even 15 Imperial planets in the local sector. Not to mention, if we're talking segmentum size, you're talking about even more, 30 to 40 Imperial planets in comparison to the single Adeptus Mechanicus forge. Now, that isn't necessarily an indication that they have super big limitations, but the AdMech do keep rather busy with all of these planets that they have to provide for, but they do keep a military as well, and that's what we'll be talking about today. The second thing, and really the last thing about them before I get to the Ordos, is their independence and their factionalism. The independence portion is pretty much what you would expect. The AdMech are not a Adeptus of the Adeptus Terra necessarily. While they do have representation within the Imperium, and they're kind of alloyed with the Imperial bureaucracy to a greater or lesser degree, they do consider themselves a insular, independent empire within the Empire. So they're very much a caste and a system in and unto themselves, and often they are pretty much exempt from a lot of the restrictions and a good deal of the oversight that is available or even required by the rest of the Imperium at large. And this has led to a couple of positive and a couple of negative things. On the positive side, it means that they get their own security network and their own services to make sure that there's no problems within their society that work a lot more efficiently than massive groups like the Adeptus Arbites or the Inquisition, which can be much more heavy-handed, whereas the Adeptus Mechanicus have fewer things to worry about, so they're groups that deal with internal security and are much more competent. And the negative side of this is factionalism. Because they're not looked into, organized, or regimented by the Imperium at large, they break up into lots of different sub-ordos, factions, groups that are led by individual priests. Every single planet considers itself the best, second to maybe Mars, or they just consider themselves the best outright, which means that the Adeptus Mechanicus is, by its very nature, not unified as an empire. Because each Forge world kind of views itself as independent of the others, and of course there is a great deal of rivalry between, and sometimes even within the same Forge there will be a great deal of rivalry and disagreement. Because of this, there is significantly less unity within the Adeptus Mechanicus than there might be if it was a purely imperial organization. That isn't to say that there's constant infighting, but it is to say that infighting, it do happen, and often certain forges will disagree with one another or vie for political control and power. And so, let us get to the Ordos, or the various sections of the Adeptus Mechanicus. The first one is the Collegiate Extremist, and I couldn't find some great art for this, so you're just going to have to look at this ugly dude on the side. The purpose of the Collegiate Extremist is effectively the Mechanicus' local police, or really closer to the FBI. It's crossing them a little bit with the Arbites because they're designed to deal with severe breaches of dogma and doctrine, referred to as the Lore Mechanicus. It's kind of their Lex, book of law, and it deals with forges and beyond them. So not only does it deal with, local law, making sure that everyone's following the secrecy code and not making any backroom deals or doing anything heretical or dangerous, but they do this on their own planet, and then of course they extend it with various exploratory groups that go out from the Forge. And the big thing about the Collegiate Extremists is that they do both major and minor crimes, but it's a lot more minor crimes. These guys are much closer to your average, beat cop than they are to the Inquisition, for example. There are a lot more of them. They're not necessarily designed for high-impact combat missions like the Inquisition are, and they're on every single forge. So you can think of them more as police. They deal with minor crimes, kind of infractions. Somebody's straying a little bit outside of the dogma or doctrine, or somebody makes a mistake. The Collegiate Extremist deals with it instead of a more militant Ordo. The rarity of these folks is very common. Basically, they have a chapter or a group on every single Forge world, but they're still relatively small in terms of military strength. Those chapters really only have to include a dozen or so tech priests and various thralls and adepts helping them out to seek out whatever issues might be occurring on the Forge and help rectify them. So they don't keep a massive military force around. Their tactics, however, are pretty reflective of this. Small unit tactics, you can imagine something the equivalent of SWAT tactics. They usually isolate their targets on a Forge world or a ship, somewhere where they can't escape as easily, because they don't have as many military forces that they can use to kind of lock down an entire city or planet or Forge. And their main goal is arrest, but they also do have the capability to eliminate targets. Unlike other groups within the Mechanicus or the Inquisition, they don't have, de jure permission to go around killing people, but they do have the authority to arrest individuals that they can prove have committed a crime. So, again, more of that policing role than the militant, murder groups that we'll talk about next. How do you avoid or defeat the Collegiate Extremists? Well, generally avoid committing public crimes, restrict your information leaks, and maintain a large and capable bodyguard unit that remains with you constantly. If you're a very wayward tech priest and you know that you're going to deal with the Collegiate a lot, I would say, apart from just battening down the hatches and trying not to commit public crimes or, covering up your crimes by mixing them in with other people, standard mob tactics stuff. Outside of that, I would say maintain with you a very consistent guard force that is too large for the Collegiate to actually deal with. If they only have one priest, a couple adepts, and 30 or 40 Theqatari and armed servitors, if you bring with you 20 or 30 Theqatari at all times, half a cohort essentially, if you're constantly moving around with them, the Collegiate's really not going to try and stand up to you, and they're going to go to their big brother if you start making really bad waves. So, speaking of their big brother, the Prefecture Magisterium, or the Malagra. The Malagra are what I call the good old boys. They are the Arcutiors. They are an Inquisition equivalent for the AdMech. They're designed to maintain the sanctity of the AdMech by any means necessary. So, very much like the Inquisition, we are looking at another force here that does not give a shit about protocol, does not care whatsoever about red tape. They have one job, and their job is to be mean old bastards and murder every single person who goes against the dogma too much to the point where they're a danger. And they are, of course, authorized and then equipped to kill almost anyone, priests most definitely included. Matter of fact, I would argue that they probably specialize in murking heretic tech priests. It would probably be high on their requirements. Rarity. These guys are relatively rare. Much like the Inquisition, you're not going to see them every day, and unlike their little cousins in the Collegiate Extremists, they're not on every single planet all the time with multiple chapters all around the damn place. The good old boys, the Arcuators, are usually old, mean bastards who are pretty well seasoned and have a decent little private army of their own, and they've decided that they would rather be nerds that love doctrine than, do something valuable with their time. So they're focused primarily upon modified, ancient, venerable, and powerful tech priests, as I mentioned. Essentially, the old money of the AdMech, money in quote-unquote here, the old money of the AdMech who really kind of back in my day their way through life, and they decide that, I want to be doing something good for my forge, but I've worked for, 200 years on one project. I want to do something a little more exciting. The Prefecture Magisterium would probably be the place that they end up. Their tactics are pretty interesting. Now, they do field private armies. What does that mean? It means multiple cohorts of Theqatari, usually augmented with armor of some kind. The other option, if you're not necessarily one of the absolute richest of the good old boys, you're going to be dealing with specialized hunter-killer teams and assassins that are intended to destroy a specific target. Now, the Malagra are pretty focused upon killing rather than arresting. And for that purpose, the private armies and, more realistically, the hunter-killer teams and the assassins, they're meant to go after specific targets, usually within the forge. So this happens at times. There'll be Sakaran Rust Stalkers or other folks who work for the Malagra, and they will just be deployed within a forge world, and they will identify a target and execute them. And that'll be the whole point. The target may not even know that they're being targeted by the Malagra, and if they are, the Malagra will prepare enough forces, they have access to a private army, in order to actually get rid of that target. And usually it's people who are a little bit too radical on the priest side. Maybe they're not quite chaos priests yet, maybe they're getting there, or maybe they're just doing things too well, too unorthodoxly. I know that there's a couple of times where very talented tech priests get taken out by the Malagra just because they are very talented and could theoretically be a danger to the forge or to the political interests of a neighboring forge. Has happened. How do you defeat or avoid the Malagra, more accurately? Well, the easiest one is to maintain a large private army of your own. If you have another force that is equal to that of the Malagra, which is hard, we're talking about something that you definitely couldn't keep around with you, but maybe you could use it to defend your own factory or your own little isolated forge area. If you maintain a large enough private army, you can deal with assassins and hunter-killer teams without too much difficulty. And if it's a private army versus a private army fight, they can at least cover your escape as you try and run. The other option is to go completely underground. So only some of these guys have private armies, while others rely upon assassins or hunter-killer teams. So focus upon forces that can kill those targets, but are also cheap enough to keep around in large numbers. So if you're not dealing with somebody who has that private army, in which case you will want to have your own private army, you want to have forces that can be cheap enough to keep around with you, but are also deadly enough that they can deal with hunter-killer teams and assassins. My recommendation is actually just cultists with plasma guns. It doesn't really matter who's holding the plasma gun, as long as they're shooting the target and you have a whole bunch of them, you're all good. And let's be honest, cultists are probably cheaper than either servitors or Theqatari, a vast majority of the time, depending on who you are, of course. I am taking this from the position of an Adeptus Mechanicus individual, in which case cultists are not a good option, but servitors would be. So having 30, 40, 50 of these armed servitors that have armor-piercing weapons, and then using them as either personal bodyguards or guards for your private laboratory or the place where you live and work, that would be an effective way of dissuading hunter-killer teams and forcing the Malagra to go with a either more subtle approach or to attack you more directly with a private army. Moving on to the big one, the Theqatari, the Ordo Militant of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the quote-unquote regular army. The purpose of the Theqatari is obvious. They are the largest armed wing of the Adeptus Mechanicus. It makes up their guard equivalent, their PDF equivalent, and to a degree, their Astartes equivalent as well. Now, there are other forces like the Ordo Reductor who really do have an Astartes equivalent, but the Ordo Reductor, unlike the Theqatari, aren't everywhere. The Theqatari are massive, and it makes up the main militant wing of almost every single Adeptus Mechanicus army, period, bar none, basically. Its main line infantry are Theqatari, which are semi-heavy infantry. I wouldn't call them true heavy infantry, they're kind of on the upper side of medium, but I would call them semi-heavy infantry, and that's their regular battle line. Then you have Cataphracti, who are, unlike the name implies, not actually heavily armored, they just use armored vehicles. They're drivers, gunners, pilots, etc. Then you have the Classiari, who are their voidsmen. We'll talk about with the Bastiladon Astra. Essentially, they're just used to fill out and replace voidsmen in general combat, so they kind of work like Theqatari, but for spaceships. And then the Heracli, who are armored mech monsters. So if you can imagine a very, very heavily modified servitor equipped with heavy weaponry, the Heracli are probably what you have in mind. They're usually custom built in a vast majority of cases, and you know, there's a lot of different things that fit into that mold. I believe Cataphrons also will fit in with the Heracli, but I would have to be corrected by the many people who are going to be making corrections on this video, because I am not very smart about the AdMech. Rarity, common. They're common as dirt amongst AdMech armies. In terms of, like, actual armies in the 41st millennium, again, they're not super common. Forges rarely send out large constituents of these unless it's directly in their interest, in which case they will send out full armies of Theqatari, which is a wild, wild deployment. But they will make up the majority of the armed forces on almost every single forge. Almost every forge world will have the majority of their head count forces be made up of Theqatari. The tactics are combined armor and heavy infantry warfare, with limited or irregular assets. Now, the Adeptus Mechanicus utilize a lot of data tethering, information sharing, and complex heavy infantry tactics, and they alloy them with armor. Now, I have my own issues with Adeptus Mechanicus armor. I don't like a lot of the vehicles. I think that they're designed rather poorly, especially for traditional armored warfare, but the AdMech are anything but traditional in terms of a fighting force. They are most accurately described as a panoply of historically inaccurate and anachronistic nightmare creatures being driven by the overwhelming force of a turbo nerd sitting miles behind the line. That is the best description I can give you of how the Theqatari actually go into combat. While they are men at their core, they can be data tethered to the point where they are barely in control of their own functions and they're being puppeted along by a tech priest at the most powerful. But either way, it's a lot of information sharing and a lot of armor plus heavy infantry warfare, and then it will occasionally be alloyed with other assets like titans, super heavy weapons, obviously different types of vehicles, and rarely, but sometimes, aircraft as well. How do you avoid or defeat them? Well, the best possible option is basically to engage with the smaller groups first. The Theqatari are a very powerful force that you don't want to face in open warfare, and the last thing that you want to do is give them more opportunities to fire at more of your men because they are so heavily geared and gauged towards the ranged fight. Now, they do have some melee units, and they're more than capable at medium to close range with ranged weapons, but they're not necessarily designed to be a charging army. That's not their job, and that's really not what they're made for. They're much more efficient when used at a ranged capacity. That means that they have a lot of scouting, and this layered attack where they have medium light infantry or medium infantry go in first as scouts and as kind of plumb bobs to deal with enemy defenses or enemy resistance, and then they bring up the assets, the heavy infantry, the armor, the irregular equipment, all of that in wave upon wave or in layers. That can best be engaged piecemeal. You don't want to face that or dig in a static position, destroy one small force, and then all of a sudden get overwhelmed by an enemy who now knows exactly where all of your equipment is. You basically want to engage with those smaller groups, eliminate them, and then once you get an opportunity, utilize ranged and indirect fire weapons to maximum capability. The AdMech lack significantly in the realm of indirect fire. Now, that's not to say that they have no artillery whatsoever, and often they deploy with the Imperial Guard, who will more than make up for it, but if possible, it would be a good option to use mortars, tube artillery, or self-propelled guns against the Adeptus Mechanicus, not only because it is very effective against their infantry. Again, body armor is great, but shrapnel is an absolute nightmare, even for the Theqatari. But the other thing is, without the ability to sight you directly, many of their weapons, including a lot of their laser, lightning, etc., and plasma weapons, will have a harder time firing up against you. And that is especially true of the Theqatari. Now, they can be stealthy and they can be nasty. We have Rust Stalkers, we have Transuranic Arquebus sniper groups, and all that type of stuff, Theqatari Vanguards and such, but those are the small groups that you want to engage with directly, but when it comes to engaging the main weight of the Mechanicus force, artillery, indirect fire, move back, and use indirect to its maximum capability before you are forced to engage with the enemy. So, moving on to the next Adepta, the Auxilia Mermadon. The Auxilia Mermadon are a bit of a weird deal. They are pseudo-mercenaries that are using heavy armor and arcane weapons on hard points on their equipment. You can see it here with this gentleman, kind of this heavy breastplate and extra armor, and then like a screwed-on heavy weapon. It's made up of a mix of specialized Theqataris, servitors, and in many cases it's actually the priests themselves going into battle. They're used to capture rogue enemies or remove obstacles using their specialized weaponry, so if there's a particular enemy fortress or a particular enemy target that requires more than average amounts of firepower persuasion to remove, the Auxilia Mermadon or a squad or two of them could be called in to deal with that problem. Due to their small size, they're not politically all that powerful, but they are militarily skilled, and they're quite useful at their kind of limited point attack jobs. So for that reason, they're uncommon or kind of medium rarity. They're usually dispatched in small bands, so squads, couple of squads, either as specialists to use their particular weapons for siege breaking, target destruction, anything of that nature, or occasionally, very occasionally, they're deployed as officers to assist in sieges because they specialize in that type of warfare. They're not technically the best at it, but they are better than the average. Their tactics, they use a lot of arcane weaponry. So when I say arcane weaponry, it's heavy stuff. You could say Volkite, gravity weapons, conversion beamers, and heavy or arcane plasma weapons. You can see here we have a conversion beamer. There could be some of them that use specialized melee weapons, but I don't see that nearly as often. It tends to be Volkite, plasma, or conversion beamers, with gravity being kind of a newer thing, and maybe not something that the Mermadon uses much. Or Mermadon. I'm gonna mispronounce these names. I'm very sorry. How do you avoid and defeat the Auxilia Mermadon? How do you deal with these bastards and their nasty weaponry? Small units should be overwhelmed if possible. If it's a squad of 5 or a squad of 3, massive numbers will absolutely win against you, because not a single one of their weapons can really work against huge numbers if they're isolated. Now, naturally, the Auxilia Mermadon are not really going to be isolated in a lot of realistic scenarios, but your goal should be to isolate them, cut them off, or set some sort of trap so that these heavy, relatively slow, very well-equipped tech priests or other officers can be surrounded by relatively cheap units and essentially ganged up on in hundreds, if not thousands, just so that you can actually make sure you take them all down. Because Volkite can hit a lot of different targets, but it sometimes has a hard time making sure that it kills those targets outright very quickly. Gravity has extreme limitations in how many targets it can hit. Conversion beamers, you literally can't hit multiple targets. You have to fire at a specific target and not move. So it can't deal with infantry whatsoever unless you fire at the ground, and even then it has very bad limitations because it'll explode prematurely, and if you get knocked around, it'll ruin the weapon's effectiveness. Plasma weapons are the only real option if you want to go anti-infantry, other than some of the melee options, which... okay, yeah, fine, but these guys are barely ever equipped with anything bigger than a servo claw and some angry mechadendrites. And if a few thousand cultists can't deal with a servo claw and some mechadendrites, maybe they deserve to die horribly. So yeah, isolate them, rip them apart, and then preferably take their weapons from them and use them for your own. Little hint there. Ordo Reductor. Ordo Reductor is frickin' wild. They are absolute annihilation missions, and they are kind of the replacement for the Adeptus Astartes within the ranks of the AdMech. They are worshippers of the quote-unquote Unmaker God. They specialize in maximum damage and destruction against any force or opponent, but they specialize in stationary siege enemies. So they want to take a target and reduce it, as the name implies. They are relatively new as an actual Ordo, but they have existed in smaller numbers before then, unofficially. And like I said, they worship the Unmaker God, some sort of horrible, evil hybrid between the AdMech's standard god, well, the machine god, let me not make it any more complex than it needs to be, between the machine god and their own cult of destruction. So, it is almost a religious activity for these individuals to involve themselves with the destruction of whatever it is they've been told to destroy. They are of medium rarity, as they are relatively new and they're highly dispersed as a force, so they will actually have armies within the Ordo Reductor, but they won't have a ton of them, because they like to capitalize on the mass and their destructive power, meaning that they're not going to be in tiny little groups like the Ordo Mermadon, but they are going to be less numerous because they are relatively new and literally all of their technology, equipment, and troops are ridiculously expensive. So they focus and rely upon unique and rare forces such as Thalax, which are basically Theqatari crossed with Marines. They don't have great They have limitations to their armor protection and such, but they're essentially massively improved Theqatari. About as big, tough, and well armed as you can make a Theqatari, period. They have very little of their own body left. It's basically just a skull and some organs. And that's them that you can see in all of these pictures. And then these folks here are these Thalax. Or sorry, yeah, no, like they're the Thanatar. So Thanatar are these big boys. They're like the Thalax, they're just kind of bigger, and they are automata. So, kind of treading on some Cybernetica ground there, but either way, they act as almost like walking weapon beasts in many cases, whereas the Thalax act much more like Adeptus Astartes, having jump packs and lightning guns and chain swords and things like that. So you have kind of this medium to high speed, heavily armored shock infantry, and then a much heavier vehicle and automata-based artillery corps. And that makes up the vast majority of the Ordo Reductor's actual forces. It's either heavy vehicles and automata equipped with heavy artillery weapons, or these heavy but also kind of medium protection improved Theqatari that are the equivalent of Space Marines in terms of aggressive blitzkriegs and things of that nature. Their tactics are a remarkably liberal use of highly destructive artillery and super heavy weapons, with the goal of removing resisting forces. Again, the efficiency kind of goes out of the window with the Ordo Reductor because they don't give a shit about perfection or efficiency. They're here to kill. They're here to destroy. That's the job. They reduce the enemy to ashes. You see a thing, you want it not there anymore, they'll take care of it. That's the point. And they are remarkably brutal. It is insane the level of firepower that they bring to bear on literally everything. It's highly concentrated, orchestrated, and directed mass destruction on the battlefield, and that is their whole goal. How do you defeat these bastards? Well, it's a little bit complicated, because we have effectively the Adeptus Astartes crossed with super heavy and high damage artillery. Avoid them at all costs. That's really the best option. And in combat, maintain mobility. Your only chance is to stay out of the way of the heavier assets. It is hard to take down the modified and unique super heavy vehicles that the Ordo Reductor uses, and their battle automata are also very tough. You're better off preferring to fight the Thalax and keeping yourself more mobile. So the Thalax and vehicles are mobile, but they're not much faster than regular tanks as a group. Problem, the Thalax are going to break off. And that's kind of what you want. You want the Thalax to come after you, and you want them to leave the Thanatars and the super heavy vehicles in the dust. Essentially, if you can cause them to come after you, that means that you now only have to deal with the Thalax, while still an Astartes level threat is now much easier to deal with when they're not backed up by some of the heaviest guns that the AdMech have available in a mobile form. So how do you deal with the Thalax now that you've broken them up? Well, you have to utilize light vehicles and multiple groups with high armor-piercing weaponry and continue to move. So, utilizing multiple groups. Why? One, the Thalax, you can get them into areas where if they destroy one group, the other one can escape. Secondarily, if one group turns and fights, the other one can flank the Thalax and prevent them from retreating. Again, they have jetpacks, but they're not, straight up able to fly wherever they want. It's much more of a jump pack. So, if you have light vehicles, now I'm talking armored cars, various levels of technicals, things of that nature, things that would dramatically outspeed a tank, even over bad terrain, you're still going to need to equip them with armor-piercing weaponry, but that's your best possible option. The other option, especially to slow down the heavier assets, is to use harassment tactics like landmines and ambushes. You're gonna lose whatever you drop behind in an ambush, and landmines won't matter as much to the Thalax as it will to the heavier stuff, but ambushes will be effective against both. The Thalax are big targets, and anything that works against Astartes will effectively work against them. And they have some disadvantages, in my opinion, when compared to the Adeptus Astartes on a one-to-one basis. On the other hand, landmines. Landmines are very effective against super heavy tracked vehicles, and slowing them down dramatically is kind of the goal when we're trying to break up what the Ordo Reductor can actually do. Next one up is another kind of robotish one, the Collegia Cybernetica. They are the oldest branch of the Adeptus Mechanicus, able to mobilize multiple cohorts and great vehicles that are entirely automated, run by programming much like a robot, and run by a lot of processing power and programming and things of that nature. Sometimes it's solid-state programming, sometimes it's not. It just kind of depends upon the design. You know, the Kuban machine is one thing versus the Castellid robot is another, but very importantly, it is robots and not AI in a vast majority of the cases. It's similar to a mix between the arcane power of Reductor in terms of their specialty weapons and equipment, and the more traditional armament of the Theqatari. So while you are definitely scaling up in terms of a lot of the weapons and firepower from the regular Theqatari, they're using, you know, tank weapons in some cases, or support weapons as a primary weapon. They're not using entirely arcane stuff like Reductor is. So it's a little bit more reasonable, kind of a middle ground between the two of those. However, they do have a bad history from back in the Heresy, and also from dabbling in some very illegal shit before that, but as a military, they are very powerful overall. They have quite a few different options, and unlike a lot of Adeptus Mechanicus forces, their specialty options are not heavily limited. Even Reductor is still heavily limited by the number of armies that they can actually field. The Cybernetica are in a lot more places. Many forges support groups of Legio Cybernetica. I'm not going to say every single one does, but a whole lot of them. Some of them have more than others, I will say. Rarity, medium. Some priests boast whole armies of robots. That could be hundreds of Castellan robots. That could be a completely robotic Imperial Knight or some other horrific machine like the Kuban machine or another type of thing. And it also goes down to smaller creatures like complex servitors, skulls, mechanical assistants, all that type of fancy stuff. However, others boast only a few cohorts of things like Castellans or Cataphrons or anything of that nature, so either way, the best stuff every single time is locked up deep within the vaults. The ones that you see most often are Castellans and those smaller little assistant robots. So, while you don't often see a Kuban machine or a completely mechanical Knight or, God forbid, completely mechanical Titan, they do exist, and if you are so unfortunate as to dump down onto a Forge World that has one, they're quite hard to get rid of, because they are directly controlled by a tech priest who is miles away, so killing off the crew for that type of vehicle is impossible, because it doesn't have one. So it is very dangerous, and they are quite rare in terms of those really big creations, but they're not unheard of, and they should be a concern whenever you drop down onto a Forge World and they're forced to defend themselves. What are the tactics for the Cybernetica? Well, it's a lot of automated robot warfare, and that doesn't sound all that impressive to begin with, but then you gotta remember, this is 40k. Automation is practically non-existent outside of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Most things are either done by servitors, done by very basic binary code, you know, open, closed, continued current, closed current, or human beings. Having a tough, data-tethered warrior, often with a lot of heavy weaponry, who has no fear, no issue with understanding tactics, no emotional instability, and is basically being controlled by someone who has no fear for their life, well, that gives them a lot of no limitations when it comes to fighting against lots of different enemies. They suffer no fear. They suffer very little attrition other than physical attrition. They don't really get exhausted. They don't really get depowered. They can carry plenty of ammunition along with them. Not infinite ammunition, but plenty of it. So outside of the disadvantages of something like Castellids having to get consistently worked on over certain periods of time to change their combat doctrine, so to speak, outside of those small limitations, they're pretty effective, and honestly more effective than robots are in most understandings of, like, robot combat. The Cybernetica is pretty darn good at their job. How do you avoid or defeat these bastards? Well, considering the data tethering, considering how difficult they are to outthink, how difficult they are to outmaneuver, and how hard they are to work down, you gotta use heavy armor. and you gotta ambush them. Realistically, I think the best possible option is to wear them out by attrition. While the Cybernetica do have cohorts of their robots, they can't replace them as easily as they can replace Theqatari or servitors or things like that. So digging in tanks or anti-tank guns and then using them to get a 1-to-1 trade ratio with the robots is going to be costly, but it's also going to be completely worth it, because while you might be able to replace, say, a single gun or a gun crew or even a tank maybe, you're not going to be seeing them bringing in dozens of new cohorts of Cybernetica anytime soon. So your goal will be to shoot for a 1-to-1 attrition ratio with the Cybernetica, and you'll be in a much better place than they will be. The Collegia Titanica, quite frankly, one of the most obvious and easy to explain Ordos within the Mechanicus. The purpose is, well, a couple of things. Outside of the obvious, Titans, they also have Theqatari and tech guards, and also some other forces that have a huge amount of political influence within the Imperium. Obviously, they are the ones who control and decide when to deploy Titans. However, only the best of the forges hold Titan legions, so things like Theqatari and tech guards, who are designed to be kind of the foot troops and the defenders of the Titan, preventing them from being invaded, jumped into or onto, or boarded, so to speak. These kind of Mechanicus forces that, let's say, mill around the feet of larger Titans and protect them as infantry. They're not necessarily on every single planet. It's mostly limited to planets that have, or forges that actually have, Titan legions of their own. Their rarity, like all Titans, is rare. They're limited, and what is more, they will only be deployed when 100% needed. That does technically mean that the Collegia Titanica could choose to deploy Titans without Theqatari and tech guards, or at least without excess Theqatari and tech guards. But very rarely will this happen unless there is a large Imperial Guard presence that the Mechanicus feel confident will be able to do the job of the Theqatari for them. And even then, how many Theqatari do you really need to essentially ride along with the Titan and protect its feet? Maybe 2, maybe 4 cohorts, a couple hundred of Theqatari, and then, 4 or 5 dozen tech guards to actually protect the internal areas of the Titan. They're not massive forces. And for tactics, it's standard Titan tactics outside of the whole base defending things that the Theqatari are doing. How do you defeat them? Well, outside of having your own Titans, stay quiet. That's really the best way. If you don't have your own Titans, or Titan killing weaponry, shut up. Go underground. Stay quiet and unimportant. If you were currently fighting a war, surrender. Back down, go underground, slide back into the slimy underbelly of whatever hive you were fighting over, and wait until the walking mountains with guns leave. It may take a couple decades, but the Mechanicus don't have the liberty of letting the Titans out for a walk for multiple years at a time. Generally. They might decide, if you've caused enough of a stink, that they would like to do that, but you are kind of running the odds of how bored are the Mechanicus willing to get compared to how long can I stay underground. The other thing is, if you're really quiet and you don't show any danger that could warrant the Collegia Titanica showing up, they won't show up. So, best thing is to not have them show up in the first place. The Bastiladon, or the Basilican Astra. This is a cruiser or battlecruiser based system of admech-claimed, borrowed, or commandeered vessels. They do make some of these themselves, they do modify others, they do buy, rent, or sometimes steal them from the Imperial Navy. Usually they slap some improved shields, auspex, and a Nova cannon onto some of the cruisers to make them into battlecruisers. Some of the battlecruisers they actually own outright, but generally for smaller ships, they're going to be borrowed or commandeered from the Navy, usually with full permission. It's rarely a thing where the Navy's like, hey, why are you taking those ships? usually the AdMech just want to put their own protectors on them, their own voidsmen, like we talked about before, the Celisari or whatever it is. They want to do that for security reasons because they're transporting stuff that's important that it doesn't get stolen or damaged. So they just want to take it and protect it with their own guys who they know they can trust. And the Navy usually doesn't have that much of an issue with it because, let's be honest, why would the AdMech ever default on a loan to the Navy? It's like, talk about biting the hand that feeds you. The Navy provides a majority of the actual orbital defenses. The Bastiladon Astra is great for transiting stuff, and it's good for some level of defense, but cruisers and battle cruisers have limitations. And the Astra is only about a tenth of the size of the actual Imperial Navy, so a vast majority of the time, the Navy will be providing at least some of the defenses for Mechanicus forces that go abroad, and for the Forge World itself. It is one of the more politically and militarily important Ordos, as it does most of the transit and orbital defense for all forges. So, again, this is alloyed with the Imperial Navy as well, but they are pretty important. They are relatively common. However, compared to the Imperial Navy, it is still usually about 1/10 of the size in terms of firepower and pure ships. For example, the Bastiladon Astra rarely has escorts and transports of its own. It usually borrows them from the local navy or, rents them permanently, essentially pays a one-time fee and buys it back from the navy, or just buys it from the navy. Now, 1/10 the size. That is basically comparing it on a fleet level to fleet level. So, for example, if there were 2 Forge Worlds in a sector, and they had Bastiladon Astra that were fairly standard. Let's say that they have 5 capital ships. Let's just assume they're all battlecruisers. They won't be, but let's assume they're all battlecruisers. They have 10 capital ships. Great. The sector total likely has somewhere between 20 and 50 capital ships. Not to mention that it will usually have at least 4 times that number in cruisers, light cruisers, escorts, and other Navy vessels. So in terms of total size, ships to ships, the Bastiladon Astra is only a tenth of the size of the Imperial Navy, generally, and it is heavily weighted toward mid-weight and lightweight capital ships, like cruisers and battle cruisers. Not a bad thing, just something to note. What are the tactics? Well, 2 big ones. They are used for massive convoys of forge ships. They will usually rent logistics ships and transit vessels, and they will bring them along with the Navy, protected by the Bastiladon Astra, often tagging along with the Navy as well. They also have the Arch Mechanicus. The Arch Mechanicus is kind of range from large battleship size to insanely oversized small moon and or small planet, depending on how you interpret the lore. These are incredibly rare. There are not many of them, and they work both as the forge ships, which also count as the Adeptus Mechanicus as logistic ships, and as defensive battleships for the Adeptus Mechanicus. Again, how many actual Arch Mechanicuses are there? I would say probably less than 100 in the entire Imperium, arguably. Are there more than 100 forges in the Imperium? No. Do minor forges have an Arch Mechanicus? Probably not. So it's very likely that some forges like Mars will have a dozen or more Arch Mechanicus marked vessels, but what are they? What size are they? They're usually completely unique, so I can't really call upon that at the moment. So these vessels require guarding, and a vast majority of the time, the Bastiladon Astra, when it's not protecting the forge with the assistance of the Navy, it is escorting important things somewhere in the galaxy. They're always on the move, protecting logistics and transport ships, including, and, most importantly, Titans in the Void, because Titans in the Void are more vulnerable than they are at any other time in their existence. So, the Bastiladon Astra basically makes it a priority to keep capital ships around the Titans at all times, so that only a massive enemy naval force can really threaten them. How do you defeat or avoid the Bastiladon Astra? Well, the main one is to identify their goal, whatever planet or identity or location they're going towards, and intercede at that location. The reason for this is that you don't want to meet them in open space because they're going to be tagging along with the Navy, or they may be assisted by the Navy relatively quickly. These convoys are usually paired, so the Adeptus Mechanicus have very little reason to just go out into uncharted space and travel the distance or take the scenic route. No, they're going to go along with Navy escorts that might already be going with, say, a tithe fleet. The Bastiladon Astra will just be like, hey, we have a capital ship and a cruiser. If you lend us a couple escorts, for this trip, we will come along with you and we can serve as a much larger battle fleet. And the Navy will be like, yeah, sure, good deal. Take these 2 escorts, they can be your eyes and ears, you get to stick along with the convoy, and we get a free extra cruiser and extra capital ship. It's a good deal. So, interceding in empty space or in the trade lanes is a terrible idea, and it's not a worthwhile risk unless the rare situation happens where the Bastiladon Astra and their escorting, whatever they're escorting, are traveling alone. If there is no Navy there, and if you know there's no Navy there, and you have a capital ship, if you have a Grand Cruiser, and a couple of light cruisers, maybe a mess of escorts, and the AdMech only have maybe 1 escort, a cruiser, and a battlecruiser, that's not an impossible fight. And that might be a time to try and take them on in the void. But that is a very specific situation, and it happens very rarely, so I'm not going to recommend it to you. Moving on to the Centurio Ordinatus, the weird boys of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and I say that not entirely ironically. The only job of the Centurio Ordinatus is to maintain and deploy the enormous arcane machinery that make up the unique Ordinatus weapons, or the unique assets of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Now there's the Ordinatus Armageddon, those kind of massive, super heavy destructive weapons. There's things like mantoliths and other digging equipment. There's multiple super heavy tanks like the Leviathan or the Mastodon. But the Centurio Ordinatus is just that job. All that they do, all that they're made for, all that they function as are people who use the big machines that no one else is qualified to use. And they are mega rare. Technically even more rare in some cases than Titans. They represent the most dangerous deployment of the Mechanicus because deploying the Centurio Ordinatus means deploying an Ordinatus grade weapon, which is basically a guaranteed, unique, and unbelievably complex, expensive, and effective weapon to the battlefield, which is why it takes up an entire Ordo in and of itself, just getting these things to the battlefield, keeping them working, and using them effectively. That's the only job of the Ordo, because it's so destructive to unleash these weapons. Their tactics are deploy in extreme security. Much like Titans, well, unlike Titans, the Centurio Ordinatus can't really defend themselves all that well, so they need to deploy in extreme security. There can be no question about the landing zone or the direction or the transit area of the Ordinatus weapon being blocked or interfered with. It just can't happen. They won't deploy if there's a threat that it might be intercepted. It cannot happen. Because the Adeptus Mechanicus don't have another one of these Ordinatus weapons just lying around. They are rare. So they demolish shit with insane weaponry and vehicles of many types. How do you avoid or defeat the Centurio Ordinatus? Well, your best option is Infiltrator, Hunter-Killer teams, or Orbital-class surprises. Most of these things have incredibly powerful void shields around them. My favorite option, and really one of the only good options for dealing with the Ordinatus weapons, other than just doing the classic thing like we did with Dora in World War II and dropping a paratrooper with some thermite and melting it down, with a hunter-killer team, the best option is to drop a flexible macro weapon to about 90 degrees with the horizon and send a macro cannon or a lance shell directly into the Ordinatus weapon. It's difficult, it requires a lot of damage and modification to the orbital weapon, and it's usually pretty obvious that you're doing this unless you're able to hide it from the enemy or if you have relative control over the skies, but if that's the case, there have been times where, like the hidden macro cannon on Reach on Harvest, the hidden macro weapon on Harvest, you can theoretically kind of shotgun one of these things with an orbital shot, and it may have void shields, but void shields can be broken by orbital weapons pretty easily, especially when they're on the ground. So, could be a good option there. But again, that requires a very specific set of scenarios. Whew, that was the entire video. I have not ignored y'all's voting. I am going to do the Helldivers 2 video next. I just wanted to do this one first to get you some more videos quickly and to quote-unquote get it out of the way because I knew it was going to be a long one. Also, sorry that this one is so late, or rather early for me. It's been a very busy day. I'm getting myself to the very end of finals, so, you know, that's going to be happening. But as we do the Helldivers 2 video, we'll be going through lots and lots of weapons, much like the Halo video. Honestly, the format's going to be almost exactly the same. We're going to go through all the different types of weapons, what I think they may be, how they compare to real-life weapons. Obviously, since it's Helldivers, I'll be speaking about Helldivers 2 lore, well, what I know of it, and most specifically, how it would work against different enemies in the lore and in real life. So, with that out of the way, I wish you all a lovely good night.